This is Medieval Middle Eastern Ceramics, and this is the lecture on Egypt and the Fatimids, and of course the pottery. So, in the last lecture we talked about Basra, which is here, and in about 975 it seems the Luster potters left Basra to go to Fustat, near Cairo, or it's in fact Old Cairo. The evidence for that I shall discuss later, but this is just to show you where things are on the map. And well, this is the actual campaign map. So one of the things that's quite important about the distinction between them is that although a lot of these motifs carried on from Basra to Fustat, as you can see, the figural art, and this isn't necessarily the finest piece of figural art found on the Fatimid pottery, is infinitely more, shall we say, realistic than what they were able to do in Basra. And so that would suggest that although the technology travelled, the painting went to new levels in Fustat. So the question is why? So this is pre-Islamic Egypt, the Byzantine period, a number of important cities, and some of them there was pottery made, as I said last week. In the Roman period, they were making these silicious-bodied ceramics in the Memphis area. Didn't actually get to immediately pre-Islamic times, but, you know, people don't tend to forget things as much as people think they do. Oh, that was crooked, go away. This is a Midas Flask made here, and that's in one of the objects that you studied in the lab last time. And also there's the important production center at Aswan. And there's an important class of ceramics and a fabric recognized by many Egyptologists. They say, oh, that's Aswan fabric. I've never actually thin-sectioned it, so I don't know what it looks like in thin-section, but they seem to know what they're talking about, so I don't want to say anything otherwise than that. Although I know some Egyptologists suggest that Aswan wares are made in more than one center. So, what can you say? So there's a number of quite nice vessels, quite nicely painted, slit painted, in pre-Islamic or early Islamic Egypt, like very early as the 7th century, with figural art on. But these, you know, they're actually better than what they were making in Basra, but this is not necessarily as good as what they're making in the Fatimid period. No matter how many times they seem to paint a woman's face, and they do seem to all be women, they were not up to the standard that the later potters' paintings were. However, there were other sources of figural art. This is, again, much earlier. This is a mummy portrait made about 100 of the Common Era. But it is thought that this tradition of painting carried on in making icons. And of course there's also the tradition of painting frescoes. There's a lot of very beautiful figural frescoes in Coptic churches of this period. So there were definitely painters painting figures in Egypt for the Coptic church and the Coptic religion. So, up to 641 and the invasion by the forces of Islam, and they would have come in from the desert and immediately created a foundation, a settlement here. This is Al-Fustat. This is the ditches, is what it means, the fossa. And this would have been a ditched encampment for the siege of the fortress of Babylon, as it was known, which controlled a crossing of the Nile about here. So just like at Basra and Kufa in Iraq, their first major settlement was on the landward side, or on the, shall we say, the Mecca and Medina side of the major river. This is the Nile going through here. And so there would be no major body of river to interfere with them being able to be supported by further troops from the central Islamic lands. This settlement became the capital of Islamic Egypt, and one of the problems is it became very smelly, and so people built more suburbs, all upwind, so the smell would be driven this way. Finally, with Al-Qahira, Cairo, in 969, founded by the Fatimids, which of course we should get to. But during all this time, there was pottery around. This is probably from a pre-Fatimid context. It looks like an early Islamic slipper lamp, molded with a copper-coloured lead glaze. It's supposedly found at Fustat, but it could be made elsewhere. I don't feel justified in cutting it up and then sectioning it to determine where it was made. This one seems to be an Egyptian fabric. Looking at where you can see a fabric, it's of a similar technology, and I think is somewhat pre-Fatimid, but not much before them. This type is certainly an indigenous industry that existed before Islam, and continued for some centuries afterwards. Pottery that looks like this was found at least as late as the 12th century. And so the Egyptologists will look at this fabric and say this is Aswan ware. I have thin-sectioned it, and it's completely unlike the later Fatimid wares, because it doesn't have Nile alluvium in it. So it is a distinct fabric, which I wouldn't disagree if it actually comes from Aswan. Yes, sometimes called Coptic glazed ware. And of course other pottery that's found in some abundance at Fustat before the Fatimids come would be the Samara horizon. And here we have the shiniest members of the Samara horizon, lusterwares, all made in Basra and found at Fustat, or in some cases excavated at Fustat. So, to the Fatimids themselves. So the Fatimids are named after Fatima Azara, daughter of the Prophet, blessings be upon him, and Ali ibn Abi Talib. So this is a Shia dynasty, and they had agents active in the Tunisia area. It's a man called Abu Abdallah al-Shii, and he was a Da'i, a missionary, and an Ismaili, looking forward to the new Imam, the new successor of the Prophet, to rule over them. And he actually knew just the chap to be the Imam, and in 909 he enters the palace city of Raqqada here on the 25th of March, and then soon after Abdullah ibn Hussein, known as al-Mahdi, was hailed as Imam and proclaimed as the Khalif. So this is the descendant of Fatima and Ali. So they create a new capital, Mahdia. So his successor, son, is known as Al-Mansur, and his successor is known as Al-Mu'izz. And Al-Mu'izz is the guy that conquers Egypt and founds Al-Qahira. So there, we're up to date. So, where did they make the pottery? So this is part of this study I was doing of where were they making the pottery at these major production centers. And here is the windrows. And of course, it's quite a well-known thing about Egypt. That is one of the blessings of the land, that the river flows one way and the wind blows the other. And here you can see the wind blows to the south and the river flows to the north. So that means you can put a boat on it, and if you put a sail up, it goes one way. If you take the sail down, it goes the other way. It's really quite convenient. So that would suggest the pottery would be in the south. And since I actually went in print saying that, they have found evidence, I've heard from personal communication, of production at a site near here. And since then, publications of a site here shows that they were finding wasters of pottery here. So pottery was made outside of the city and downwind, exactly where you'd expect it to be made. So they made pottery with clay that was partly Nile alluvium. The Nile is a very important source of clay for potters in Egypt, has been since they started making pottery in Egypt. And the material comes from Ethiopia, so it's filled with bits of Ethiopia, which is mostly basalt terrain. And so all of this stuff, there's little bits of basalt and minerals from basalts in here, as well as other rocks that have picked up on the way down. But most of the sediment comes from Ethiopia. Now, this is not the same as your average Nile alluvium. It's got more quartz in it. See, there seems to be a lot of quartz been added to it. And also, it's more calcareous. There are more nodules of calcium carbonate, and the fabric as a whole is more calcareous, as can be determined by chemical analysis. So I call it the CA Nile, the calcareous Nile fabric, of which there's a couple of variants. One is more nilotic than the other one. This is the more calcareous one, I think. So mixing clays is not an unusual thing to do in Egypt and in the Nile generally, but I think in this case they had particular reasons to do it. This is an SEM picture of a glaze of one of the lusterwares that the luster potters made here, and it's full of tin. That's all the white bits. And of course on top of there would be luster paint. So as I've told you, luster painting is a very demanding technology. And you paint the luster paint on to a fired vessel, so it's a shiny, glossy, shiny vessel, and you paint on it and you fire it again. And if you fail to get the glaze sufficiently molten, then the paint will not fuse to the surface. If it gets too molten, then the paint as a whole, which if you remember it is basically a lot of earthy media and stuff like this, will fuse to the surface, and that'll just be an ugly black mess, not very attractive at all. So it's very important that the glazed recipe they developed in Basra is used to go with the luster paint. Otherwise, all sorts of bad things happen. And so an aspect of glazes, other than it needs to work with luster paint, is that it needs to work with bodies. And I suspect that they played with the body in order to make it fit better with their glaze, because they didn't want to mess with the glaze because that would interfere with the luster paint. So they made this quite unusual mix, which creates this buff-coloured body with lots of little black bits in it. And so this is actually quite distinct. It looks like a buff fabric. It looks a bit like, say a donut or something that someone's put pepper in. And so this unusual fabric is really quite distinct. So to the actual evidence that the potters moved. Now, of course, that's an old kind of approach. Yes, people moved and took technology with them. And since then we thought, well, people are clever. You can have independent invention. And so then people moved towards the idea of independent invention. I believe the potters moved. And that is partly due to my data that in fact lusterwares and indeed tin-opacified glazes were not commonly made in the Islamic world. In fact, there was one production center before 975, and that was Basra for lusterwares, and there's only a couple of other centers that made tin-opacified wares. And so this was not a technique you could easily make up. It was, in fact, a very difficult and challenging technique. And it might be argued that the hypothesis of independent invention being something that is easily done is somewhat arrogant to suggest that ancient technologies are easily repeated. And so in this case, I believe this technology, this medieval technology, was not something that was easily repeated. And so the precise recipe for a tin-opacified glaze came along with the luster paint technology. And it's also suggestive that the forms were a complete continuation of the forms that they made in Basra. All of these forms, particularly the ones at the top, less so the ones down here where they're doing weird things, and also this flat rim you didn't get in Basra, but things like these simple rims and this recurve rim, very common, and this short foot, this ring foot, ultimately probably copying Chinese pottery. But these lusterwares, as I think I've told you, are found all over the world, and they're often copied. They're copied all over the Islamic world by potters who can make quite convincing copies, but who do not have the technology. They're not luster painted, they're like slip painted or something. And so you have potters who are copying lusterwares will often try to copy the form, but they'll always be constrained by their own traditions. They will not look at, say, how they do a foot ring and copy that. They will do the feet the way they are used to doing the feet in the tradition of where it is they're making it, like in northeast Iran, for instance. This seems to be a direct continuation of the Basra tradition. And so, along with it being a continuing tradition, along with it being a difficult to reproduce technology, and also that it seems they stopped making lusterwares in about 975 and started making lusterwares in Egypt in about 975, rather makes me think that these people got up and moved. And it's again, could have done with a map now, and it's actually quite common at this time. The establishment of the Fatimid dynasty created a lot of new jobs for people, and a lot of people are recorded to have left employment in places like Iraq to get jobs in Egypt with the Fatimids. One of the attractions to them being, if you were Shia, this is the Shia Caliphate, and so you'd want to support it possibly. So, when you get to the lusterwares, and again we have a form and motif sequence, of which this is a selection, of course. And so this is a very typical reverse motif found on the Basra pottery, and we find it on all the first phase of lusterwares made in Egypt. And another interesting thing, apart from this calcareous Nile fabric, some, very few, of the pottery of this period, they are made with a very experimental body. And this is mostly clay. So this is a scanning electron microscope image. So the matrix here is clay, but there's no inclusions in it to indicate that it's Nile alluvium. There's really no inclusions in it at all, except there's quartz, large pieces of quartz, quite large pieces of quartz, like the sort of quartz they were adding to the other clay, but not the quartz that was native to the clay, shall we say. And another additive are these inclusions. See, this round thing here would have originally been glass, and it's still glassy on the inside, but as it cooled, crystals developed within it. And so you have inclusions of glass and quartz in a clay matrix. And you can see by the vesicularity of it that it has become very vitreous. So this is quite a nicely made piece of pottery, and I think is a result of the experimentation of the potters to create a body that worked with the glaze and with the luster pigment. This idea may have been known to the potters in Iraq. This is a bit of glass that I found in a piece of pottery probably made in Baghdad. And so it might be that adding glass to a clay body was something they did once in a while. And when they got to Egypt, they used it more experimentally to create an entire body. So this is possibly the heyday of lusterwares, this first century or so, or 50 years of production of lusterwares in Egypt. One of the most well-known, in fact the only known potter we have is a chap called Muslim ibn al-Dahan, who signed this one. Somewhere visible, I think. Yeah, down here somewhere. And what this means, he's Muslim, the son of the painter. That's what the name means. So this chap is the son of a painter. Now, since his name is Muslim, I have to wonder if that might suggest that his father, the painter, was not a Muslim, but was in fact one of the local Coptic painters. So it might be, this is pure hypothesis because there's no way of determining this scientifically, that one of those Coptic painters possibly married into a potting family, and their child became one of the great artists of Islamic ceramic art. Marrying into the family, I think, is a possibility. When we get into Iran and we have more signatures, there is more of a suggestion that the potters are a big family, possibly with people marrying into it. So we'll have a look at that idea again when we get to Iran. So this is when we get the best figural depictions in this Fatimid era of people that really seem to be really understood how they work. Even if the face isn't quite as expressive, the figures themselves and some of the other things, non-human figures, are very well done. This you can see is clearly someone dancing, not whatever the other people are doing. And here you can see this is the reverse. It's quite uncommon for people to publish the reverse as well as the front, but thankfully here they've done that. And this is a very nice one of face as well, a nice figure, very realistic, and a very large bird. This is presumably somebody important. Only an important person would have such a large bird, like an eagle or something. And this is the painted reverse. We have a lutenist and bunnies. I thought I'd throw the bunnies in, quite like the bunnies. And of course, it's important to realize that there are things other than bowls once in a while. Bowls seem to be far more common for the decorated pottery, so it's better to create a sequence. But yes, there are jars. So contemporary with the earliest lusterwares will be pottery like this. And I say contemporary with the earliest lusterwares, this is in Egypt. This one, because these all look pretty much the same, don't they? But this one down here actually seems to have been made in Samarra. So it's probably a part of the Samarra Horizon ceramics. And these, although they look basically the same, are made in Fustat, of the same fabric as was used to make the lusterwares. So they're presumably made right at the beginning of production of pottery by the Basra immigrants, shall we say. Soon afterwards, however, they start making very different things, completely unlike the Samarra Horizon, although somewhat related to those blue painted wares, because they are made of different glazes. And this one, there's two different types here, really, because this one has a white glaze. You can see it going all the way underneath here, upon which blotches of copper turquoise here, and manganese purple here, and again you have green, and this is greenish again. This is actually in the paint, in the glaze, I should say. And so, whereas this one, there is no underlying glaze. All of these are different applications of glaze. So they're very different technologies, but they look quite similar. And the forms are exactly the same, and the fabrics are exactly the same as the lusterwares. So the second phase is characterized by incision through the paint. So what they would have done would be to paint the surface of the pottery with the paint, then let it dry, and then scratched away at it to decorate it further. This isn't particularly attractive, but they did more interesting things with it. Another characteristic is this tall foot ring, very distinctively different. And another thing is they seem to have developed stone paste. So this is stone paste, which we get alongside the calcareous Nile fabric. And this is it. And scan it through a microscope, you can see inclusions of quartz. So stone paste, we have treatises describing this, about 8 parts of quartz, 1 part of clay, 1 part of glass, and that's basically what we see here. The glass and the clay will fuse together to fuse the quartz together, so that's just the matrix within what is basically a quartzy body. And so this type of body becomes the predominant type of ceramic body once the luster potters leave Fustat and go to Syria and go to Iran, and becomes the dominant type of body for most of the more higher quality, shall we say, greater man-hour investment, shall we say, ceramics made in the Islamic world. And this is actually, I photographed this with a high-powered microscope, so you can see what you can see if you get one of those hand lenses. Because if you look very carefully, you can see right through this glaze. This is not a tin-opacified glaze. This is a clear glaze, and you can see the same as you see outside, which is that it's made up of crushed quartz. Oh, yeah, and there's a red dot. So some of the, so you can see the incised line through the paint. Some of these are very finely done. This one is a nice piece of evidence of that it was a interfaith community in Fustat under the Fatimids that Muslims and Christians seem to get along quite well, so that they might have intermarried in the previous generation is probably not that difficult to understand. This is Jesus, by the way, in case you don't recognize him. Cross, you see, and halo, okay? Whereas this is just a Coptic priest with his incense, you see. This one, typically this group will have nothing on the outside, unlike the previous group, but this one has written on it Saad, which could be a personal name or could be a blessing of happiness. Nobody really knows, but they all seem to be made about this time, so it could actually be a person. Here we have a warrior. Again, we see the incised lines through the paint. And here you can see the incised lines through the paint. Here too, it's again showing you there's things other than bowls. So here's something from Aleppo in Syria I'd like to bring to your attention. And Ravello near Amalfi in Italy, and Corinth in Greece. This is the Aleppo pottery. I worked on the excavations in Aleppo Citadel, and Aleppo, Syria is often a debatable area between Egypt and Mesopotamia, Iraq, shall we say, or Iran, throughout history. And the Fatimids are often trying to get a bit of it. In this period, they either had clients running Aleppo, and actually in 1038 they occupied it themselves. So it's probably not weird that there's pottery of this period with incised lines in Aleppo at this time. And it's interesting to note about the Fatimid pottery is that we very rarely find it in the rest of the Islamic world. It seems we only find it in areas controlled by the Fatimids. So that would be very interesting, because the Basra pottery is found all over the Islamic world, but the Fatimid pottery is not found all over the Islamic world. It's found like that was in an occupied area. This is outside the Islamic world entirely. This is in a church. This is the Duomo of Ravello, the cathedral, and inside there's this thing here, which is called an ambo, which is where a place to do talking to people from, which is supposedly built in 1130, and it was made with pottery. See? On the ambo is this mosaic, and this is pottery. You get even closer and you can see they're lusterwares. They broke up lusterwares to stick into this. There's also this other pottery, and I'll get to that in a minute. So if you look at these lusterwares, you can see they have opaque glazes. And it's important to recognize I wasn't able to dig these out and thin section them. So all I could do is stand here with my hand lens and peer at them very, very closely. And I can tell you that these are opaque glazes. And on them is luster paint. The luster paint is in various monochrome luster hues. Now, I've not said this before, but one of the aspects of Fatimid lusterwares is that they seem to have either less control or less concern about the chemistry, either less control over the firing or less concern for the chemistry of the luster paint, and it has a number of different hues, colors. So you can see these are all different colors of luster paint, and it's very typical of Fatimid lusterwares. Another thing you might notice is the lusterwares are incised. And although you can see this is quite interesting, this is a luster paint on a turquoise vessel. So the incised lines and also the turquoise vessel with luster paint on it are indicative of, in fact, phase 2. So that would be about right. So this is from Corinth. These are very early albarelli. An albarello is a very important type of form used for trading things in, as well as making just nice pots. These are made in Egypt. I've just looked at the fabric, but remember me telling you how it looks very distinctive? It looks like it's been covered with pepper or something, but that's what this fabric looks like. It looks like that fabric. And also, and I'll show you this on the pottery, one of the things about the Fatimid pottery is they often will glaze the interior of a bowl with different glaze to the outside of the bowl. Often in the case of the tin-opacified glazes, the quality of the interior of a bowl will be better with more tin in it than the outside. This might not be an unusual tradition, and maybe everybody glaze one side, then glaze the other, and then let it outgas in between, let it dry in between. But they seem to go into making different, and we have a number of vessels from Fatimid Fustat that would have one color at the bottom and another color at the top. So that the fact they were doing that seems also to be indicative. And this is what albarelli looked like later on. Here you can see this one is from Raqqa in Syria, this is Damascus in Syria, and this one is actually from Spain. So another type of ceramic is this. These are very important. That's what the other monochrome colored pieces were in the Ravello mosaic. So these actually have entirely stone paste bodies, and then they have transparent glaze over them. So this glaze is actually chemically exactly the same as a tin-opacified glaze, only there's no tin in it. So if you remember, a tin-opacified glaze will have alkali elements as flux, but also lead elements, because the lead will come in with the tin. So in order to fire these vessels, possibly even in the same kilns as the tin-opacified glazes, they have the same properties in the firing. So they have lead and they have alkalis. So that is why this one is turquoise and this one is green. Because this is a lead alkali glaze. And in this case, it'll depend on the fugacity of the kiln whether this comes out copper or green. And this one's cobalt, this one's manganese, this one's got a bit of cobalt on it, and this one is iron. And this is a big green pot. I just thought I'd throw that in there. It's very nice. So then we come to a completely different fabric. Now, I used to think this was a continuous sequence of production of Fustat, and although there seemed to be evidence that the other group were made in Fustat, or at least somewhere in Egypt because of the Nile element, I was never sure about this fabric because I knew it was similar to other fabrics from the coast of the Levant. And it seems that other people doing petrographic analysis have sampled wasters and found that this is made in Beirut. Isn't that exciting? So this is actually a Beirut fabric, not a Fustat fabric at all. And it's very fine and has big chunks of calcium carbonate in it. And this is quartz. So this is what the pottery looks like. So these two phases in this sequence, so it's still the same sequence, it's just the potter's moved. Because all this pottery, or most of this pottery, was actually found at Fustat. Well, this one was actually made in Syria, found in Syria. So this is some of the Fustat lusterwares, but they will have the same fabrics as things found in Syria that I just showed you. So this is all made in the same center, and it was a lusterware production center, and it seems that it was Beirut. So Beirut has taken its place as a lusterware production center. Congratulations, Beirut. So this is the dating evidence. One of them is this chap, Muslim bin al-Dahan, or Ibn al-Dahan. Some of the things he signed were also dedicated to people who had titles that we know must have existed at about this period. And so then this chap must have existed about this period. So that actually works quite well, that most of this stuff is about this period. Then we have Pisa. Pisa, there are a number of churches. We can actually refine the dating of this better. Like in Ravello, where you saw they took pottery and stuck it into a building, here in Pisa they took whole bowls and stuck them into buildings. This is on the exterior, however, and as you can see by the incised lines that this is from phase 2. Now I'm going the wrong way. And this is Tel al-Asharna, this whole vessel. This is archaeologically a whole vessel. It's amazing that you can break an entire vessel on the ground, cover it with dirt, and come back, and there's going to be something missing. I don't know what happens. I don't know if pixies go and always hide pieces of pottery so that you never find the whole damn thing, but this is as close to a whole vessel as you get in the archaeological record. Unless you find an actual whole record somewhere, but usually that's found by looters. Tel al-Asharna is up here. And this is a very interesting site I worked on. And this was an Iron Age tell that the archaeologists went there and found Islamic pottery on the top. And so they came to me because they were horrified. And I looked into it and found that this site was only occupied for a very short period. Because it was built to besiege by Crusaders. It was built by Crusaders, a castle. They built a castle here to besiege another castle, which was Muslim. But it only existed for a few years and then was probably completely demolished again. Which does happen. It's not a weird thing. And so this was probably loot. And will be quite a good date for this pottery. So that brings up the issue of Crusaders. There seems to be, this is actually the Crusaders out here, there does seem to be this distinction on all sites in the Crusader-occupied Levant, that Crusader-occupied sites have this stuff on it, and sites that are pre-Crusader will have this stuff on it. So it does seem to be this major distinction from one to the other, which made me think of other things, bad things that happen, because it's quite interesting that that's about somewhere. It's not that far away. It's over here somewhere. One of the things about Egypt is the water all comes from here. And so there is times, and I'm sure you've heard, that they have famines in Egypt. Sometimes the water fails up here, the monsoon rains or something, and so all that water that usually comes down here fails. And when it fails, it's a big problem, because without the river, Egypt is this, it's desert. And so there is famine. And so periodically, in ancient times and in medieval times, there was famines. And look when they happen. So this was one famine, which happened right where I have hypothesized the distinction between Group 1 and Group 2. And then also there was the Khalif al-Hakim censured Fustat, which meant he sent his troops down there to kill a lot of people and be very unpleasant to them. which is probably less damaging that there was a famine. So there's a famine here. Coincidence? Maybe, maybe not. Who knows? Here, there's a really big famine. So there's a famine here, but then there's this really big famine here. And, you know, as famines go in Egypt, you have the stories of people eating the dogs and the cats and that sort of thing. And that's like a normal famine. But in this famine, people were eating each other. It was like a real bad famine. And then we had the Seljuk Turks come in about this time. Then we have some ordinary time, and we have the Crusaders come. I'm calling them Franks here because it takes less room. And then they come back again. And then it's taken over by the Ayyubids here. And that's basically the end of the Fatimid dynasty. So putting this here, I thought, well, you know, that's quite interesting that you have all these things. I have these quite well-defined groups, and about when I think they stopped, you have unpleasant things happening, which made me think maybe we do not have continuity here. Maybe we have small periods of abundance in which people are making lusterwares. And that's what creates the gap. It's not actually a gap. You have a lot of pottery made here, which look like one way, then things gradually change into another group up here, where there's abundance and they're making lots of pottery. And that happens, and they move to somewhere else and make pottery there. And the interesting thing about this hypothesis is that when you get to the pottery from Iran, which have dates written on it, there's clear evidence that that's what happened. And so it may be that is what we actually have here, that the phase 2 is not from whatever this is, 1025 to 1075, but was mostly made in about 1050 or so. And maybe this pottery was not made from here to here, but was mostly made around here. So, who knows? So we have potters came from Basra and then came to Fustat. In about 1075, we now know potters left for Spain. They left for Syria, Beirut, over here somewhere, and on to Iran. And here, we don't do Spain. It's too complicated. Somebody has to work on it. Syria and Iran we'll be covering next. Thank you.